Today we are moving on to aorist verbs. Up to this point, we have looked at the present tense, the imperfect tense, and the future tense, and today we're going to move to the aorist tense. The present and the imperfect tense, you might remember, were similar in that they both used what's known as the imperfective aspect. That is, they look at an action internally, or they're focusing on the continuation of an action. I am untying, or I was untying. The future and the aorist focus on an external aspect, a perfected aspect. And so for the future, it's I will untie. I can look at it as a completed task, or I will build this skyscraper and I can look and see it completed. The aorist also uses that perfective aspect. So I went to the shops. It's something I did. It's finished. I finished the task. I can look at that action as a whole from the outside, an external point of view. Or I built a tall tower. Look, you can see the tower. There it is. So it's not about the internal aspect, but it's about looking at the completed task, a finished task. So that's the perfective aspect. When we're forming the aorist, this past tense perfective aspect using the Greek, there are sort of two patterns that we want to look at. The first is known as the first aorist, and we're going to look at the active voice. In order to build this verb, we need a number of things. We obviously need the stem of our verb, so we're going to stay with luo. So the stem there would be lu. And we need to add in our tense formative. We saw a tense formative last week when we were looking at the future tense, and that was just a sigma. With the aorist, it's a sigma alpha, so lusa. But we obviously also need to be using our personal endings. Last week, we were looking at our present and future tense endings, these primary endings that are blacked out here. But today we're going to be using the secondary personal endings. So we're in the aorist tense, so we're using these secondary endings. And so for the active voice, we're obviously going to use a variation of the on sn omenete on, what we used when we were using the imperfect. Okay, so the last thing I need in order to build my aorist is I also need my augment. So we pop the epsilon on at the front of our word, just like we did for the imperfect, and that tells us that we're in past time. And you'll remember that I mentioned when we were doing the imperfect that we only use the augment when we're in the indicative mood, because only in the indicative mood does the aorist have past time. Okay, so these are the building blocks that make up our aorist. We've got our augment, our epsilon. We've got the stem of the word. Here the stem is lu from luo. We've got our tense formative, which is sa, and we have our personal ending. So lu sa men, all the various parts of that together would mean we loosed, we loosed. The personal ending there, the men, we know this really well. We've seen this lots of times. That's telling us that it means we. It's first person plural. And then the augment is telling me it's past time. So it's either imperfect or it's aorist. But I can see that I've got this tense formative. That didn't exist when I was in the imperfect. So that's what's telling me that I'm actually in the aorist, not in the imperfect. So the imperfect of this word was lu omen, you might remember. So no tense formative. And that would mean we were loosing or we were untying. Whereas this one, lusamen, means we loosed or we untied. So it's got that completed aspect, a perfected or completed aspect. So this is what it looks like when the aorist active indicative declines. This is its pattern. It goes elusa, I loosed, elusas, you loosed, elusen, he, she, or it loosed. Elusamen, we loosed. Elusate, y'all loosed or yous loosed, plural. Elusan, they loosed. You can notice here that it is a variation, as I said, on the on, s, n, omen, ete, on endings that we saw when we were using the imperfect. So instead of on, we get sa. The new drops out. Instead of s, we get sas, because obviously we're working with our tense formative here, right? So we still retain that sigma. Sen, so this is the only one that has an epsilon. All the rest have an alpha. Samen is the same as the men. Sate, because of that alpha, our ete moves to an alpha. And then the last one there retains something that's a bit more similar to what we saw in the imperfect, sun. So unlike the imperfect, where we weren't able to tell the difference between the first person singular and the third person plural, with the aorist we actually can, because we've got a distinction. The first person singular doesn't have the new on the end, whereas the third person plural does. So that's actually quite helpful in the aorist. So the aorist active indicative is elusa, elusas, elusen, elusamen, elusate, elusan. So we're not really learning a new set of endings. All we're sort of doing is adding in that tense formative, that sa, and then retaining these endings. We obviously don't have a connecting vowel anymore because of that tense formative. Then when we move into the middle voice, we have a lot of the same things here. We've still got our augment. We've still got our augment. Let me just get my pen back. Still got the augment. It's telling us we're in past time. We've still got the stem of the word here, lu from luo. We've still got that sa, but instead of using our active endings, we're now obviously going to be using our middle passive endings. So instead of on, sn, omenete, on, we're now using these ones, main, u, eto, metha, este, onto. So these were our secondary middle passive endings, that fourth sort of set of endings that we learned. And so here I can tell that it's come from the word luo, meaning I loose or I untie. I can see that it's past time, so it's either imperfect or it's aorist. But because of that sa, I know that it has to be aorist, because that's our tense formative. It's changed the form of the word into a different tense. And then I'm using my middle passive endings, so it has to be a middle. And metha, I know, is first person plural. And so because it's got that middle sense, it's something like we loosed ourselves, or we ourselves were loosing, or we ourselves were untying. And so this is what the aorist middle indicative looks like when it declines. Again, we retain that sigma alpha as our tense formative. We obviously keep the augment, and we're using our middle passive secondary endings. Elusa main. Let me just grab my pen again. Elusa main, that's typical. Elus o, this is actually the one that stands out as quite different. Elus ato, elusa metha, elusaste, elus anto. So those endings, apart from our second person singular, which is where we would normally have an u, it lengthens to the omega. It lengthens to the omega. And then the aorist passive, you might remember when we were looking at the future passive, we had theta, eta, sigma. when we're using our aorist passive, we use a variation of that. So it's just the theta eta. And I don't know if you recall, last week I talked about how you might want to think about the theta as a reclining chair. And so when you're in the passive mood, you're reclining, you're relaxing, you're looking very passive. So the theta is meant to be a bit of an indication that we're in the passive. And so this is what it looks like to build the aorist passive indicative. Again, we've got our augment, we've got our stem, then we've got our aorist passive tense formative, which here is theta eta, and then again we're using the same endings. So the meaning of eleuthemen would be we were loosed, because that passive sense, so it's something that's happening to me, but it's past time, we were loosed, and it's completed action. So it's not we were loosing like you would see in the imperfect, it's we were loosed, it's completed action. So this is what it looks like when the aorist passive declines. It goes eleuthein, I was loosed. Eleuthes, you were loosed. Eleuthe, he, she, or it was loosed. Eleuthemen, we were loosed. Eleuthete, y'all were loosed. Eleuthesan, they were loosed. Now you'll notice here that you've got this theta eta. Hang on, let me just grab this pen back. You've got your augment, you've got your stem, then you've got the theta eta, which is telling us that we're in the aorist passive. And you might remember that our endings for the secondary active were on, s, n, omen, ete, on. Now I have no idea why the aorist passive seems to be attracted to these active endings. I don't know why it is, but that's sort of what we're getting here as a variation. So you've got the theta eta, and then you've got that nu from the from those imperfect endings. Then you've got the theta eta and the sigma, which is the sigma from the imperfect endings. Then you've just got a theta eta. There's no nu there. Theta eta, and we've just got that men. Theta eta, we've got the te, and then theta eta, we've got sun, which is similar to what we saw with our aorist active. So this one's a little bit odd. I don't know why. That sort of uses a bit of a hybrid there between the two forms. So I'm not sure why this seems to use these active variation of active endings, but it does. And so you just have to remember that the main way that you're going to be able to tell that you're in the aorist passive is not so much these endings, but rather this tense formative. So just that's going to be your clue. When you see that theta eta, you know that you're in the aorist passive. So this is the morphology, if you will, of the imperfect versus the aorist. So like the imperfect, we always have that augment at the front, which is indicating that we're in past time. But we have these slight variations between the imperfect and the aorist. Variations like the introduction of that sigma alpha. So if you saw eluon, you would know that you were in the imperfect eluon. There's no sigma alpha there, right? So that would be I was loosing. But if you saw elusa and you see that tense formative, you know that you're in the aorist, and so it's I loosed. A different word here from therapeuo, and if I was saying I was healing, it would be therapeuon, that is our imperfect, I was healing. And then if I wanted to make that into the aorist, I would say etherapeusen, Etherapusen, I healed. If a verb begins with a vowel, the vowel is lengthened. We're already familiar with this idea. We talked about this when we were looking at the imperfect, and exactly the same rule applies. So if you had something like a kuo, we already know from the imperfect that alpha is going to lengthen when it joins up with the augment, and so it becomes a kusa. They lengthen. You might remember last week when we looked at the square of stops that we have this thing that happens in Greek when you've got certain sounds come up against a sigma that creates a stop in your mouth. And so when you're trying to pronounce it, it becomes difficult to pronounce. And so the Greeks, either a letter drops out or two letters combine to form a more logical letter or a letter that's easier to pronounce. Exactly the same rules that you learnt when you were doing the future apply when you're doing the aorist. So when you add that sigma onto a word that has, let's say, a dental at the end, your dental is going to drop out. So your d, t, z, those dental sounds, the sounds that you make with your teeth. The guttural or the velar or the palatal sounds, those ones that you make in your throat, the g, k, k sounds, just like we saw when we were doing the future, when they come up against the sigma tense formative for the aorist, they're going to combine and make a xi, right? Exactly the same. And with the labials, the ones that you make with your lips, p, b, f, those ones, when they come up against the sigma from your tense formative of your aorist, they're going to make a ps, ps. Exactly the same rule that we saw when we were doing the future. But just to be aware that the same thing that happens when you're doing the future will also happen here. So we saw that when we were doing the future form of blepo. Blepo in the future becomes blepso, blepso. And so, again, when we add the sigma alpha, to blepo, when we want to put it into the aorist tense, it becomes blepsa. But the augment there, the epsilon, is telling me that we're in past time, and I see that psi, and I know, oh, hang on a second, that comes from blepo, and I can tell there that I've got an alpha, and so I know that this has to be the aorist, not the imperfect. Again, just like we saw when we were doing our future, contract verbs will usually lengthen their contract vowels. So something like agape, or agapao will become agapathen. So our contract vowel will lengthen. Again, we already saw this when we were doing the future. So there's nothing new to those two rules. If you learnt those rules last week, the same rules apply when we're in the aorist. There are what's called second aorists. Now, these are also known as irregular verbs, and so they have a slightly different way that they are formed. And we see this in English as well. So when you want to talk about something in past tense in English, sometimes you have what's known as regular forms. So live becomes lived, jump becomes jumped, stall becomes stalled, right? So these are all pretty regular. You add ed on the end, and we are now in past time. But we also have what's known as irregular verbs in English, right? And so they form differently. It's not super logical. Eat becomes ate. Go becomes went, which is a completely different word. Speak becomes spoke. Have becomes had. These in English are irregular verbs. We just have to memorize them. There's no way of knowing why go becomes went. There's no logical way of remembering that eat becomes ate. You just have to memorize them. And the same is true for certain verbs within Greek as well. Some of them are really easy to recognize. They're a very slight variant on the stem that we know really well. So just like speak becomes spoke, it's pretty obvious that those two are related. But then you have other ones that are super irregular, like go and went, and they're basically two different words, and so you might as well learn them both as two different words. I'll show you what I mean. You can have a word like lambano. I take or I receive. When you're in the imperfect, we maintain the stem of the word. So take off that omega on the end, you're left with lamban, that's the present stem. And when you move into the imperfect, you keep the same stem. So labanon, I was receiving. However, when the word lambano goes into the aorist tense, for some reason, the stem of this word reduces. It reduces down to a shortened form, and this shortened form is lab. Now, the two are related. You can see you've got the lambda, the alpha, and the beta. So it's a reduced form of that word. But because of this change in the stem, because of this change in the way that this word moves into the aorist, for some reason, because of that change, the Greeks didn't feel that it was necessary anymore to supply that sigma alpha. That sigma alpha that we learnt with our first aorists was what told us that we were moving into the aorist. So let me remind you, you had the word luo, right? And when luo goes into the imperfect, it becomes lu on. Now, how do I know that I've now moved into the aorist? If I wanted to make luo into the aorist tense, not the imperfect tense, well, I need to include my tense formative, lu sa. I'm now using this tense formative. That's what's telling me that I'm in the aorist tense, not in the imperfect tense. However, with these irregular verbs, because the stem changes, so it goes from lambano to just lab, we no longer need the tense formative to tell us that we're in the aorist, because the change in the stem is enough for us to know that we're not in the imperfect anymore, because the imperfect will always use the same stem as the present. The present and the imperfect will always use the same stem because they're related. Remember at the start of this video, I talked about how both the present and the imperfect, they're related. They both use the imperfective aspect. And so there's this relationship between the present and the imperfect. Whereas the aorist will sometimes use its own stem, a modified stem, and so we no longer need this tense formative to tell us that we're in the aorist. Okay, so the first example there, lambano. When lambano goes into the imperfect, it becomes labon. When it goes into the aorist, when it goes to the imperfect, it becomes lambanon, and in the aorist, it's labon. I received, or I took. The next example here, pino, meaning I drink. Sorry, my brain just went completely blank. In the imperfect, it's pinon. We retain the full stem. And then in the aorist, part of the stem drops off. It just becomes pion. These two are obviously very, very similar, and so it's one to just be aware of. What about pipto? Pipto, meaning I fall. Pipto, when it goes into the imperfect, becomes pipton. I was falling. But in the aorist, it actually has a different stem, quite a different stem. The different stem is pes. So it becomes epeson. So pipto changes to pes. So when a word like lambano, for instance, reclines, it actually uses the endings that we saw when we were learning the imperfect. Okay? So second aorist verbs, so verbs that have an irregular form when they move into the aorist tense, second aorist verbs, use the same endings as the imperfect, on, sn, omenete, on. And the way that you know that this is an aorist is because it has a modified stem. Because the full form of this word is lambano. So I'm using a modified stem. So, elabon, I took or I received. Elabes, you received. Elaben, he, she, or it received. Elabomen, we received. Elabete, you received. Elabon, they received. Now, there are some words that not only have an irregular stem when they move into the aorist, but they also slightly change the ending as well. So an example would be, and this is one that's just worth knowing and memorizing, the word gnosko, meaning I know, when it moves into the aorist, it takes a different stem. It takes a reduced or shortened version of its stem. Essentially the vowels drop out, so we just end up with a gamma, nu, and an omega. And so instead of getting, if I can get my pen back, instead of getting gen on, right, or on, these two vowels combine or contract, and essentially that omega just ends up dropping out. So the rules of contraction apply here, which is why something like gnosko, when it moves into the aorist tense, actually looks slightly different. But all that's happening is we're getting contraction. So egenon, egenos, egeno, egenomen, egenote, egenosen. Oops. What about the aorist middle? The aorist middle. So for words that are middle only, so words like ginomai or, oh gosh, my brain's just gone blank. I can't remember. I can't remember any middle verbs. Aorist words that are middle only, when they go into the aorist, they obviously then use these middle passive endings, the middle passive endings. And so we see here that for ginomai, the stem changes, it reduces to gen, and then we add on our middle passive endings. So it becomes egenomein, egenu, egeneto, egenometha, egeneste, egenonto. So there's been a change of spelling to the stem there. So here are the irregular aorist verbs that I would recommend that you actually memorize, because they do have this different stem. And so in my view, I think it's just worth memorizing them. And so when you've got your flashcard, I would suggest that, for instance, say you had your flashcard and you had the word, let's just put Barlow. Say you had the word Barlow, you might want to add with a little asterisk the word Baal underneath, just to remind you that this is the alternative stem that we'll find when we're using the word Barlow, meaning I throw. So ginomai becomes, in the aorist, becomes ergenomain. Again, notice that it's using those middle passive endings because it's a middle-only word. Ginosko becomes ergenon. Barlo becomes erbalon. Lambano becomes erlabon. Anebino becomes anebane. Very, very similar. It's just a slightly reduced version of that. So we've got a contraction there of our alpha iota. So super similar. And then, so I would say those ones are fairly recognizable, but then we've got these ones that are completely unrecognizable. And so these ones, if it were me, I would memorize these almost as separate vocabulary. So not so much on the same vocab card like this one, but actually as a completely different word. Just like I said, in English, we've got something like go and went, two completely different words. There are second aorist verbs that are so different that I think it would be worth just memorizing this word separately. So the ones that are worth taking the time to memorize is blepo. Blepo, when it moves into the aorist, becomes adon. Adon. I don't know how you would find a relationship between those two. Erkomai, I come or I go, when it goes into the aorist, becomes aelthon. Aelthon. Esthio, which means I eat, becomes ephagon. Ephagon. Lego, means I say or I speak, becomes apon. Apon. Pharaoh, which means I bring or I carry, becomes anekon. Anekon. I've put a sheet on the quest page and on Brightspace for you, just as like an idea of a way that you might want to try and memorize these words. I've come up with some little memory devices, little mnemonics, learning sort of sentences to try and memorize these. Some of these I've adapted from other sources, like the textbook gives some examples of memory devices, and some of them are the ones that I've just made up myself. You can use these if they're helpful, or maybe create your own. But here are some examples. So blepo, meaning I see, turns into adon in the aorist. So how am I going to remember that those two words are related? So I might come up with a sentence like this. I see, because that's what it actually means, I see my friend and say, hey, Don, hey, Don. That's a way of me remembering that blepo, I see, when it moves into the aorist, becomes hey, Don, hey, Don. Erkomai, we know means I come or I go. So I go to the pub and drink some ale through a thong. Ale thong. Ale thong. Ale thon is the aorist of erkomai. Aelthon. Erkomai. I come or I go becomes aelthon. I go to the pub and drink some ale through a thong. Esthio. Esthio, meaning I eat. I eat while watching Fargo. Fargo is a TV show. And that's how I remember that esthio becomes ephagon when it goes into the aorist. One more, lego, meaning I say or I speak. I say there's an ape on my Lego. I say apon, there's an ape on my Lego. There's an ape on my Lego. So the ape on is what's reminding me there. So I don't know why it's not highlighted. I don't know why it's not in purple. But the there's an ape on. This is the memory device here. There's an ape on my Lego. I say there's an ape on my Lego. Ape on is what's telling me that that is the aorist. So they are just some suggestions of ways that you might want to memorize the aorist. I have others. I won't go through them in this video, but you can look through those on the quest page or on Brightspace. Occasionally, some of these words can have slightly different spelling. It's almost like the Greeks got confused between their own rules of first aorist and second aorist. And so occasionally you'll see an alpha. So instead of elthon, it will become elthan. Instead of ebalon, it will become ebalan. Very, very occasionally you'll see that. It's not very common. And hopefully if you see it, you'll just remember that occasionally there are some spelling changes in the Greek. I will do some translation in a separate video, but I think that's enough for now just to take in the content.